My mum frequently reminded me that when I was a young child, barely able to walk, she used to push me to the shops in the pram then. And one of the routes she went to was over the River Lostock at Bamber Bridge. We used to call it Dandy Brook. And apparently I was fascinated by watching the sticklebacks swimming below the footbridge. And from a very young age, I had this fascination with fish. And when I was old enough, I went down to the river with a bottle tied on a piece of string with a worm in it. And that's when I caught my first fish. A few years later, I was bought a fishing rod for my birthday and was allowed to then go fishing in the rivers and the ponds locally. And I carried on fishing till I was 18, including some competitive fishing. But I kind of discovered ecology when I went to university at Liverpool and haven't looked back since. So I'm John Lamb, Senior Conservation Officer with the Lancashire Wildlife Trust. I've been working for the Wildlife Trust for nearly 21 years now. I've got an interest in rivers as well as other habitats, around Lancashire. It's not just rivers, but there is, this particular fascination with rivers, I think, like most people. Because it's water, which is a life force which we all depend on. It's a source of inspiration to go swimming, paddling in from a young age, watching the fish, catching the fish, seeing the wildlife and the aquatic flora and fauna. Well, there's quite a few people I could choose. David Attenborough is probably one of the biggest influences, who I have had the pleasure of meeting together with most of the other main naturalists. But David is such a kind of a well-spoken, educated, enthusiastic, knowledgeable person who I think is so highly respected. And not just by people interested in natural history, but I think he's a role model and a big influence and inspiration to so many people. More so than other naturalists. But I think, probably put David Attenborough at the top of the list. And despite his age, he's still doing what he can and getting out there, going to major events around the world, but also speaking on the media locally and increasingly saying how important it is to really think about the impact we're having as a species and to change our ways so we reduce that impact and can live sustainably. A similar influence would have been my professor at Liverpool University, Professor Tony Bradshaw, who again had that kind of David Attenborough kind of look and enthusiasm about him. But he had a passion for how plants could colonise very hostile places, industrial wastelands, and the coal mines of Wales, which were heavily contaminated, as a growing medium. But despite that, vegetation had the ability to colonise and survive in these substrates with very high levels of heavy metals or man-made substances. And he was one of the first people to start studying and to try and identify the genetic makeup of the plants that enabled them to survive, because it wasn't all specimens of that species, it was only certain ones that were able to tolerate these very toxic to other plants, levels, and just that, the way we've affected the land through mining and quarrying, and particularly, and then just dumped the waste, then provides basically fresh ground for succession, for that colonisation by the pioneer plants, which then form the first soils, and then that starts that process developing of then insects are able to then feed on the flowers, and then you get the soil building up and the habitat, the communities forming, and then all the birds and the mammals moving. So that process kind of has been happening for millions of years on this planet, but you don't often see it happening in front of your eyes. But you go to a landscape like that and you see it's almost like, going back to scratch after the life first formed on the planet, and plants started to take over. So he was the one who introduced me to that process of succession, and was so enthusiastic and interested in how that process starts, and pass that on to me and hopefully the other students in the course. So we're here at the confluence of the River Hodder and the Ribble. It's called Hodder Foot, and I chose this because it's one of the accessible and beautiful river confluences. We have the Ribble, which is a primary river, which by primary I mean it has a source which flows directly into the sea, whereas the Hodder is a secondary river which has a separate source, but its end is where it flows into the Ribble, so it doesn't have an estuary of its own. And it's the two whilst they converge into one, the two rivers above this point are quite different in character. There's the physical, the chemical, the biological, and you could say the spiritual aspects of the river are all different. But here, those elements all combine into the one. So we've got this meeting place of different river chemistries, different river biologies, and the spiritual side, because we use water for blessings, baptisms, the sacred wells and springs. Our connection with the water in different faiths goes back, probably to the creation of those faiths. So there's a different influence in the spiritual side of the two rivers, and here they come together. And it's there's a heron there feeding on the rock. The walk up to this point, we saw swallows, swifts, house martins and sand martins, all the main hirundines, and there's the water crowfoot in flower at the confluence here. So it's a beautiful spot, both to look at aesthetically, the sound of the water, but also this coming together of the two rivers at an accessible but also very beautiful spot. So that's why I chose this point to come to today. Well, the main challenges facing the rivers, and we could talk about these two rivers as an example representing many other rivers, is the input of pollutants into them, which affects the water quality for the flora and fauna that depend on the rivers. The rivers are significantly cleaner now than they have been in the past. The main pollutions from the industrial revolutions have now disappeared, and the main inputs now are from sewage works and from agricultural runoff. It's not necessarily deliberate input, but the application of pesticides, fertilizers, sheep dips onto the land can end up in the water and cause big problems for the aquatic life and the fish that are then affected. There's also the kind of wrong connections from developments. So instead of the water from the sink and the bath and the washing machine going into the sewage works, they end up going directly into the rivers. So that misconnections and also overflow from septic tanks in rural communities which aren't maintained, and then instead of the septic tank working very well, the tank overflows and then that water ends up in the river. So with ongoing development, this aspect isn't necessarily going away, and in some areas it could get worse. People do pour chemicals down the drain in the street from the DIY projects, and then that ends up in the rivers. Unscrupulous contractors, instead of taking it to a licensed disposal or landfill site, will just tip it down the drain, and then it ends up in the river. So the rivers are facing a lot of chemical inputs, and as something that people can do as individuals is check their connections on their own house or their own property or business, and to make sure that they are connected right, and then what's going to the sewer is going to the sewer, and the water that falls on the roof is the one that's going into the river without being polluted from these other sources. When we look at the fish life in particular, then they have not just the problems they face on if they're migratory fish. To this point, there's the barriers that they face to continuing the journey to the spawning grounds. The work of the Ribble Rivers Trust is addressing those barriers to migration, and fish passes are being put on some of those structures and weirs, or indeed the structures are being removed altogether to enable that free movement of fish to the spawning grounds. With increasing cleaning up of the rivers and the removal of the barriers, then we have the opportunity for the fish populations, particularly salmon and eels, to recover to hopefully to former levels. But there is the aspect of what's happening in the sea. Again, there's the pollution, there's fishing, legal and illegal, as well as an increasing problem which people are becoming aware of, is the issue of plastics, particularly microplastics, which is in the smallest invertebrates, and then is being eaten by the fish, and ultimately is being eaten by people as well. So the issue of plastics, which thankfully has now come to is on the national agenda, we will see some positive movements, but people can do things of their own initiative with plastics and start to reduce their use of single-use plastics, and not to use the products that have microplastics in them that end up coming out of the bath or going in the washing machine, which then pass through the sewage works and end up in the aquatic environment. So people doing what they can, as well as helping out with the Ribble Rivers Trust and other organisations in their work parties along the riverbanks, to help the health of the rivers, the cooling of the rivers by planting or allowing trees to grow in the right places along the riverbanks, because rivers would naturally be very shaded and cool. If I have a river with no trees on the banks, then the water temperature increases, and that isn't good for the majority of the aquatic life. Well, there will be lots of projects I could think of that are by the riverside, which have kind of made an impression on me. But one of the most obvious ones, which I'll choose because it's so easy for people to visit, is Brockholes, just on the outskirts of Preston, which was a former sand and gravel quarry just next to the M6. And when that was finished, the Trust bought the site and has made it into a nature reserve, put in a floating visitor centre on one of the lakes that was left by the sand and gravel extraction. Put in hides, walks, a play area for children, set up forest schools in the woodland areas. We run a health and well-being project with people with mental health issues. So it's accessible to all ages, all abilities, all faiths, and it is well used by all manner of different people. And there's a message there about the nature, health and well-being, how people can engage in different ways. It's not forced down your face. The site is used for many different by many different groups in many different ways, for training and education, just relaxation, for photography, for art, and it's a way of what was agricultural land on a floodplain being turned into an educational nature reserve with a lot of messages that can help a lot of people. So as with the conservation officer with the Wildlife Trust, the role is very varied. It also very much, I can do the things that I kind of want to do and choose to do. So the main things at the moment in June 2019 is out in the field doing surveys. It's mainly grasslands at the moment. That's because the grassland project is coming to an end. So I'm going back to sites that have had work done to see how that sympathetic conservation management has enhanced the condition, the quality of those grasslands. But every day in the field needs a day in the office writing up the results and writing up a report. So that's taking time at the moment. Other times of the years, local authorities will go out to public consultation with their local plans or policies or strategies for that local plan, or for planning applications. The planning applications is on a weekly basis, whereas the local plans might be every 5 or 10 years. But they come along with a time scale. So those plans, policies and applications need to be assessed for the ecological impact, and then where appropriate, an objection or a comment, or even in some cases support for those plans, policies or applications. Fundraising is part of the role, and then having secured the fundraising, so I mentioned the grassland project, that was a 5-year project with a project officer. I secured funding for a bee or pollinator project, and also for an invasive species project. So those 3 members of staff all need line managing and supporting. So that comes as part of the job. And then I lead guided walks and training courses, both for the Trust and other organisations, to identify, for example, trees in summer and winter, grasses, sedges, rushes and ferns, as well as wildflowers. Or it could be on how volunteers can do habitat condition assessments or habitat surveys as a training course. And I lead guided walks for various organisations, pointing out the flora and the fauna that can be seen. Some of these end up becoming guided nature trails. So I am working with Roughly Parish Council in Pendle at the moment to identify some nature walks around the parish and to produce some guided leaflets that people can go around and follow. And I enjoy that diversity, and that the fact I have the flexibility to choose and direct the work as I like to do it. Well, facing changes with or without Brexit, there is the Environment Bill, and that does present possibly the first time in 50 years for changes to be made to the way we manage the land in a positive way. The Environment Bill will, rather than paying land managers for the amount of food that they produce, be that crops or animals, is now looking at paying landowners for the contribution they make to the landscape, to public access, to biodiversity, to the quality and the quantity of the water that flows on and off the land, but also to carbon capture. So this hasn't happened before in this country, and we now have that first and unique opportunity to be holistic in the way the land, the soil and the water is managed. And if that's done correctly, and the opportunity is being presented to do it correctly, that the soil condition will improve, the water quality will improve, the biodiversity will improve, and hopefully linked with that, the landowners and the public's knowledge of the interconnectedness of everything we can see, the trees, the fields, the water, the hills, that joined up holistic thinking and managing the land so that everything and everybody benefits, is a tremendous and very exciting prospect. So I really do hope that that potential is realised. Between 2007 and 2017, in my spare time, I travelled around the county visiting the largest, the most accessible and the most important examples of the natural or semi-natural vegetation that Lancashire has. So, from the hills, the river valleys, the ancient woodlands, the ancient grasslands, the peat bogs, the lakes and tarns, and the limestone pavement at Silverdale. I went to these places and kind of catalogued them into the most important, be it at European or national or local level, the biggest and the most accessible. And then I've written a book called Lancashire: A Journey into the Wild, which goes through the habitats and gives information on the wildlife and the accessibility of these sites. And I would encourage people to go to the local rivers, the local woodlands where there's access, and to spend time and get to know them. Appreciate the flora and fauna at different times of the year, make a connection with nature, which is great for not just fresh air and exercise, but our health and well-being. So the best places to go, and the most natural, the most important places to go are highlighted in the book. And so people can dip in and out to it. They could just decide, we've got a free Saturday afternoon, what should we do? Choose a place in the book and go and visit it with the family or on their own or with friends. And I encourage people to go out and have their own journey into the wild and experience it in their own way. And hopefully my book will be a source of inspiration and guidance for them.
Our Talking Rivers series of audio productions has been brought to you by Ribble Trust as part of the Ribble Life Together project. It celebrates the rich cultural, social and natural heritage of the Ribble Catchment. Creating the series has been made possible by National Lottery players through the Heritage Fund. For more episodes and information, visit ribblelifetogether.org.